Hello. Thanks so much for waking up so early to come out to this marketing talk. My name is GABBY DARIENZO. I'm a Toronto-based indie game developer and artist. I'm also the art director and co-founder of Laundry Bear Games, which is also a Toronto-based studio. And our debut game as Laundry Bear is A Mortician's Tale. So if you haven't heard of it, Mortician's Tale is a narrative-driven job simulator where you play as a funeral director running a funeral home. It's very cheerful. And tasked with the things that funeral directors are normally tasked with. So preparing the bodies of the deceased for burial and cremation, attending their respective funerals and talking to their loved ones, and also kind of going behind the scenes and seeing what the business is like and interacting with your bosses and clients and whatever. We launched Mortician's Tale last year for PC Mac, and we're launching it for a new platform this year. It's the Vita. You guys caught me. It's not the Vita. Don't tell the Vita community. So at Laundry Bear, like most indies, we wear a lot of hats. My background is in graphic design and marketing, and I've been making games professionally for 7-ish years. And so at Laundry Bear, my role is art director as well as game designer, but I also do marketing as well as a bunch of other different things. And so even though Mortician's Tale is very niche, I'm going to use that word a lot today, and very small, I wanted to make sure that we took the marketing really seriously for it. And that worked out really well for us. We were very critically successful, like pretty financially successful, and we got a lot of attention, a lot of really lovely reviews. We were nominated for some awards. We did really, really well for ourselves with this game. And often the question I get from other really small indies that are making games like us is, how did you get this much attention? How can we do the same thing? And so I wanted to put this talk together to kind of share my insights marketing a Mortician's Tale and kind of give y'all some feedback, and not feedback, but insights so that you can also hopefully find the same success or greater success with your own indie games. Okay, so I broke this down into like 6 things that we did really well. I could talk about marketing for like 4 hours, so this is gonna be a really dense talk. But probably the #1 thing we did really well for ourselves is that we started planning really early. And basically, in 2015, I made a prototype in Pico 8. And as soon as we were like, yeah, this is the thing we want to spend a couple years making, that's when I started thinking about marketing. And that might seem really, really early, but ultimately, I see a lot of developers mess this up a lot, where the game will be like coming out next week, and they're like, shit, we should make a website for it. Also, can I swear? I'm so sorry. This is like my automatic settings. And so, you don't want to wait until the very last minute to be thinking about your marketing. Marketing takes a lot of time. It is a full-time job on top of your job, which is making games, right? And so thinking about it early is really good because you're probably at like the very, very beginning. When I say early, when I say the beginning, I mean like once you have concepted or prototyped a thing, or even if you have a mock-up and you're sure, like, yes, this is the thing we're going to make, that's when you should start thinking about it, because logistically, you're probably also thinking about things like budget and schedule. And it's a really good time to think about, okay, marketing is going to take time for us. It takes time to update websites and press kits and go to events and run social media. And that's time that you should be thinking about adding on top of what else you're doing for your games, if you can't hire someone to do it. It's also a really good time to be thinking about budget, right? Because you're already thinking about budgeting for your games and understanding that marketing can cost money. So attending events and having merchandise or whatever, or paying someone yourself or one of your employees to do marketing, that takes money. So it's really important to kind of plan ahead for this kind of stuff so that you're not going to be surprised at the very, very end with all these surprise extra time and extra money. And so it's also like, okay. For Mortician's Tale, I'll talk about Mortician's Tale really briefly with this. We knew it was a very niche game. It was really small. I didn't want to put a lot of money or time into marketing it. And so we did a lot of stuff to keep our marketing costs low. And we also looked for funding to help us out with travel. So that's something I recommend. I know Canada has a lot of really wonderful funds and like grants for travel. And so if you're not from here or if you're from somewhere else, or if you are from here, do some research, look into funding. There's a lot of really good things that can help you just travel to events or different export funds. So, and also, I'm going to talk about this really, really briefly, but do your market research. And basically what market research is will your game be viable when it launches, a year or two from now, right? And market research is a thing that is like a talk in and of itself. It's like, it's very, very, very important to do. So I'm not going to get into it, but it's very important. We did it with Mortician's Tale. And I recommend that you do it too. So the rest of this talk is just making the assumption that you have done your market research, you're very solid on the thing that you want to make. So quick note. The second thing that we did really, really well for Mortician's Tale is that we had a very strong brand. And I know that branding can be really nebulous for a lot of people. It's really hard to kind of think about. But essentially what branding means is just what makes your game special. What is unique about your game that when people see it, they'll go like, ah, yes, this thing. And so here are some questions to figure out your game's brand. One of them is, what is the hook of your game? What is the thing that, again, makes your game unique? Is it something mechanic related? Is it art, audio, narrative, theme? What is it that makes your game special? And figuring this out will help you, A, stand out from everybody else, but also helps you figure out what you should be focusing on in your marketing materials, your screenshots, your trailers, that kind of stuff. The second thing is, what is the tone of your game? Is your game lighthearted? Is it serious? Is it cute or moving or horrific? Figuring out the voice that you want to convey with your game will help you figure out the voice you want to convey with your marketing, because it's really important that those two go hand in hand. Figuring out your audience. Are you marketing to kids, adults, core gamers, casual gamers? Figuring out who you want to market to will help you figure out things like what social media we should be using, what events we should be attending, blah, blah, blah. And lastly, what is visually unique about your game, if anything is visually unique about your game? Games are inherently a visual medium. It's really, really important that our games stand out. So what is it about your visuals that help them stand out from other games? And so ultimately, asking yourself these questions and figuring out your brand sooner rather than later is really helpful, because it will help you make marketing decisions going forward. And ultimately, your marketing should support your game and go hand in hand with your game. So here are a few examples of games that are coming out this year and or next year that are really, really fantastic and great looking. And based off these screenshots alone, you probably have a pretty good idea about what these games are. You probably have a pretty good idea about what the mechanics might be. And you also have a really good idea what the tone of the game is going to be, right? Like Wandersong is definitely a very different game than like a horror game, right? Like it's the really important thing about this is that all the branding for these games is very cohesive, right? When you see an Ooblets poster or social media, you know exactly what game it comes from because it's very, very cohesive. So for Mortician's Tale, we had really, really strong branding. When you see screenshots or the trailers or the logo even or merchandise or whatever, you can connect it to the game immediately. And a lot of that comes from the game's unique visuals, which support the game's unique premise and theme. And also voice, right? Mortician's Tale is not a horror game. It's very much a like lighthearted, sad, but kind of hopeful game. And so I didn't want to use the saturated colors or grayscale or gore or anything. And so using a lot of purple really helped reinforce its sad but hopeful feel. And the important thing about what we did with Mortician's Tale branding is that it's very cohesive. We do it throughout the game. Every screenshot looks like it's probably connected to the other ones. But we also did it throughout its marketing materials as well. And so when you see, I hired somebody to do the key art, whose art looks very different than this. And but when you see it, hey, I know exactly what game this is connected to. And a lot of this goes back to just my first slide, which is just thinking about your marketing early. The third thing we did is we found our audience. So once you figure out, when you're thinking about your branding, who your audience is, the next thing is to figure out where your audience is and how you can connect to them. So social media can be really beneficial, but I see a lot of developers that do one of two things. Either they'll like just use Twitter and nothing else, or they'll have every possible social media imaginable for their game. And chances are you probably don't need a Pinterest page for your, for your game. And so it's really, really important that you figure out what works best for your particular game, you as a developer and your studio, and that you go there. It's important to also remember that the more social media accounts you have, the more work it is to maintain them. It isn't like you can just be like, yep, I'll copy and paste this between Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, whatever. Every social media has their unique thing, and so you have to make sure that you're planning post and content specifically for that social media. And it can be a lot of work. And so just, pick what you think works best for your game, go where your audience is, and don't worry about the rest. And if you're not sure, if you're pretty early on in development and you're not sure what you want to use, it's okay to park pages. And when I say park, I mean sign up for an account and then just don't use it, right? And so that way, if anybody wants to sign up with a similar thing, at least you have it and they can't take it. So like if like a death metal band was like, Mortician's Tale, well, too bad, because I have everything. But very importantly, you want to go where your audience is, even if it's a social media or platform that you're not particularly familiar with, right? So for Mortician's Tale, we figured out pretty quickly that our audience was a lot bigger than we initially thought, which is really cool. People were really interested, or at least curious about the subject matter. And so we figured out over a little bit of time that our audience is mostly, or like primarily women, mostly teenagers, lots of teenagers, and lots of people like 30 plus. And a good chunk of them were people that were not interested in games, so much as the subject matter first and then games. And so around that, we were able to figure out, okay, like Twitter was really good for us, lots of game developers and press on Twitter. Instagram was really good with the youths. And Facebook was really good with the olds. And so, sorry if anybody uses Facebook. And sometimes it means if you might have to go to a social media or like place that you're not used to using. So for me, I don't use Facebook, but I did for this, and that worked out really well. I have a note here that says not Tumblr, and that's because I made a Tumblr page thinking that the youths would be really into it, and then they didn't notice us, and so it's okay to also abandon pages if you're not getting traction, and that way you can free up more time to do other things. And lastly, just how you reach your audience is going to be unique to the game you're making. So what we did for Mortician's Tale is going to be very different for our next game, which is going to be very, very different. So just, what you learn from one game may not always work for the next thing you're working on. Okay, so you reached your audience through social media. We're going to talk about how reaching them through appropriate events. When I say appropriate events, I mean pick what events are best. If you're thinking about going to events, you don't have to go to every event ever. Not every event is going to be good for your game. Your game's not going to be good for every event. So pick what is best for your game. So for us, Mortician's Tale is very niche, not just in terms of its subject matter, but also in terms of what kind of game it is. There's a lot of text, but it's not a visual novel, and it is a very quiet and sad experience. So a lot of people aren't really comfortable playing it in public, where it's a very loud space with a lot of stuff going on. So we didn't choose to go to PAX or E3 or Gamescom. It just didn't make sense for us. But we did choose to go to Double Fine's Day of the Devs a couple years ago and Fantastic Arcade, which were both fantastic for, no pun intended. But they were both really, really great events for the kind of games we're making, because they're both very indie-focused. Day of the Devs is very varied. They have a lot of range of things, and both of those events were really, really great for us. Not only that, but a lot of press take those events seriously. And so a lot of people saw our names on the list of who was showcasing at those events, and we got a lot of press out of that, which is really cool. And so it's really important to remember that exhibiting takes a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of money, and those are valuable resources for us as indies. And so every time that you go to an event, you have to remember that it takes time away from what you're going to spend developing your game. And so not just in terms of going to an event, but also making demos for events takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. So you don't have to go to all, choose wisely, pick what's appropriate for the thing you're working on. All right. The last thing I'm going to talk about is marketing research. So I talked very briefly about market research at the very, very first slide. And this one is more just about being aware of what is going on in the current landscape of games. So, being aware that marketing tactics always change. Things that people talked about 2 years ago might not be relevant anymore. Some things will always be the same, like things I talked about earlier with like, you know, have good branding, think about things early. Those things are not going to change, right? But things like what social media you use, is Discord still going to be a thing half a year from now? You know, that stuff changes on the regular. So make sure that you're always kind of doing your research and seeing what's going on. And also, you know, don't make assumptions based off of past things. Again, things change so quickly here that sometimes things people talk about a couple of years ago may no longer be relevant, right? Or maybe changing. So a good example of this with Mortician's Tale is it's kind of become accepted knowledge that, like, don't launch your game in Q4, it's bad. And while there's a lot of reason not to do this, right? There's a lot of AAA that comes out, they're all aiming for a holiday. You don't want to be competing with frickin' Zelda. There's also, you know, I think it happened last year and it happened this year where a lot of indies got really freaked out and just released their game in August. And that really sucks because, okay, you're not competing with Zelda, but now you're competing with a billion other people who are making similar games to you, right? And so Mortician's Tale, I did some research. I was looking at the landscape of games last year. And I think it made a lot of sense for us to release in October. It's not a horror game, but it is kind of spooky. People are more willing to play with the game around October than they are other times of the year. But I also did a lot of research, and I looked around at like what other indies are coming out, what other AAA games are coming out. Does it make sense for us to launch this time of year? And we did. We decided to launch in October of last year, and it worked out really well for us because there were not a lot of other indie games coming out. The only AAA games coming out was Mario Odyssey released like 2 weeks after. And we're not competing with Mario Odyssey, like it's a very different game. And so because of that, we got a lot of press, but I think a lot of press specifically from places who probably wouldn't have covered us otherwise. I think they had a lot of time to play our game because they didn't have a lot of other games to play. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think this is just an example of do your research, look around at what's going on, don't make assumptions, just kind of look at the current climate. And lastly, I want to make sure that I make the note that marketing is not a guarantee, right? You can do everything right and nothing can come from it, and that sucks. But sometimes it just depends on the game you're making or the timing in which it comes out or just luck. But I do think it's important to put the effort in. Something is always going to be better than nothing, right? But just consider this and don't forget about this when you're thinking about marketing your game. Because, you know, if you're thinking about spending $30,000 on enamel pins, think about, okay, well, is this going to be worth it if our game only sells 1,000 copies, right? So I didn't mean to end on such a sad note, but to recap, so some tips for y'all is plan your marketing early, figure out your hashtag branding, go where your audience is, exhibit your game at appropriate events, and do your research. Oh, there's emojis. Those are different than the ones I put in. Cool. Thank you so much. Yay.